Welcome to Take It Up with Jessica Lee. I'm here with the VP of Corporate Operations from Oracle, Troy Tazbaz. Troy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. We'd love to hear more about what is corporate operations for you. What's your scope?
Sure. I am responsible for looking at our data center expansion strategy. So what that entails is looking at the world from various components like sales planning, market conditions, particularly data privacy and sovereignty laws that drive our ability to deploy the customer into the cloud in specific markets.
Okay, well, there's a lot of transformation going on, right? And a lot of Oracle companies that are going through that transition. So part of your responsibility is also helping them. Right. And I'm fascinated by what you do because you have this global view into different countries and the different risks, the compliance issues, and the political changes that are going on. So, for example, Brexit. Share with us your thoughts on that. What's happening?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll maybe first answer your first question, which is, Oracle has been transforming as an organization, and that transformation is really going from being a software and hardware vendor to being a service provider. And what that entails is that initially we started, developing software and hardware products. The hardware came in through the Sun Microsystems acquisition. And then we would send the hardware or the software products to the customer where they would actually deploy it into their own data centers. So a lot of the business processes that we had as a company entailed effectively sending the product to the customer and then supporting that from their own locations. As we pivot to the service provider operating model, what we have to shift is effectively how we are looking at the world in a slightly different manner. And why that's important is that it could be anything from our data privacy analyses around hosting customer data. That's and as well as where we're hosting the data as well. So what's going on in the world is that the world is becoming much more fragmented in nature, and part of that fragmentation is coming from data privacy laws, where a lot of countries they want to protect their own citizens' data, and that data is PII, personal information.
The European GDPR.
Right, the GDPR is a perfect example. So as part of that transformation, what we've had to do is kind of look at a lot of the processes that had developed, and very mature processes that were developed for a specific type of business model. And we had to say, well, are these processes working? Like, are tax analysis working when we're the owner of the asset that is being deployed into these countries? Do we have necessary logistical strategies around clearing customs and doing last mile technology or last mile transportation? We've never had to do that in the past. Right, so because we would send the equipment, or the software would be downloaded and the customer would be responsible for taking ownership of that.
I see.
In the cloud world, that changes. Since you control everything, you have to control the manufacturing to the deployment and the ownership of that asset. So we had to effectively start looking at the business differently, as well as looking at metrics differently, and how we are measuring the success of the business in individual lines of businesses. Brexit is obviously been a big topic for us because, like all the other cloud providers, we're dealing with data. And England, or UK in general, is the second largest economy in EU that had been operating as a single market, and that includes all of the privacy regulations that come with it. So. How Oracle did this is that we look at, EU and say, where are the best places to build data centers? And that's driven by the data center market and the maturity of those data center markets, what we would call tier one markets, and London being one of them. And obviously ease of doing business, anything from, the import regulations to cross-border data transfer to, tax policies. With the uncertainty of Brexit, what we're running into is a lot of our customers that were hosted out of UK are, they're also dealing with this uncertainty of not knowing whether they have to comply with, any kind of regulation that would be imposed on them if UK ends up leaving, the EU.
EU, that's right.
Right.
because your data has to be in the EU territory.
Right. I mean, if you look at, since GDPR passed, that it was enacted as a regulation, heavy fines have been imposed on several Silicon Valley companies around data privacy violations. So what's going to be very interesting, and this is I think the uncertainty from my perspective, but also probably from the industry, is that how quickly would they start imposing those types of fines, or what is the grace period? Now, EU has initially, before the current uncertainty of UK exiting EU, they were going to impose a 2-year grace period after the March 29th deadline that was initially set.
Okay.
Which means that companies would have about 2 years to kind of figure out how to comply with UK becoming what they would call a third country.
Yes.
Within the EU laws. So now I think that we're all kind of waiting with anticipation around, how EU is going to react with the third vote that did not get passed.
Yes.
Whether UK would go on another referendum of asking its citizens to vote again for whether they should go for Brexit. But I think what's going on within Brexit in EU is actually what we're seeing globally, which is something that I'm responsible for evaluating. And what we do is we look at everything from import regulations to data privacy laws to emission laws that are being sent because data centers are obviously drawing a lot of power in these countries. Mm-hmm. And making sure that we're proactively monitoring what's going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. So given that there is uncertainty, I think businesses are already taking the steps to make sure that their data center investment is within the current EU territory and not have to wait for the Brexit to go one way or the other. Right? Yeah,
and after the Brexit vote came in, I think the data center industry saw a very large procurement activity going on outside of UK. So in EU, there are really specific markets that would be considered tier one markets, right?
Like Amsterdam,
Frankfurt, obviously London, and you could even consider Paris to a degree. Mm-hmm. And how it's, that's driven by everything from, ease of doing business to construction regulations to fiber availability.
Yes.
So now you take, one of the largest economies out of EU, who happen to also be a tier one market and from an ease of doing business. For
English speaking, which is the launching pad into Europe for a lot of American companies.
Right.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, cloud providers or even to a degree financial institutions are kind of looking at, well, what's going to happen? You have to not just migrate your customers, but you have to deal with stranded investments that you've made.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's going to end up being one of the problematic things that I think any company that has significant operations in UK might end up kind of considering.
Okay. So Troy, what are some of your challenges that you're facing dealing with different countries and governments?
Well, there are obviously external challenges that are driven by, regulation. Mm-hmm. And if I'm talking about the external challenge, it's really around, legislation being drafted without necessarily understanding the impact to the businesses that have to implement those standards and regulations. And, I've been a fairly proponent on, the government officials wanting to work with the private sector around what is the best way of drafting a policy. Right, in the sense that it's good for consumer protectionism or business protectionism, but it's also implementable. If a policy is not implementable, then it becomes a hindrance to progress and innovation, but also growth. Right, and years ago, EU passed a law. Well, they created this program called the CRC, the Carbon Reduction Committee, and in that. They had they had written that they wanted to cap the amount of power you can consume. Now, if you break down that problem, and I worked with at that point, our government affairs teams around a potential response to that. Well, if you cap the power that you can consume as a business, that means you cap growth.
Yes.
Right? They cap the amount of things that you can deploy and use power. Well, if you cap that, you cap your revenue. Well, from a government perspective, what happens if businesses are having to cap a revenue?
Less tax.
Right? So it's almost to a degree. The problem that they were trying to solve was right, in a sense that, as large cloud providers and businesses who are consuming, massive amounts of fossil fuels and generating a whole lot of emissions, they have to think about this problem. But again, that was a legislation that did not necessarily kind of connect the dots around why these things are being used.
And the consequences in the end, yes.
Internally, as I mentioned, we're going through what someone could consider a seismic shift as a company, right? Pivoting from one type of business operating model to a different type of business operating model. And the challenge is really around looking at the entire business, the way it operates, and say, okay, well, we have great processes, great metrics, the way we track the business, but are they all applicable to a different type of business model? And how do you create that dynamic way of looking at the business where, because for years we're going to have to obviously operate two different types of business models, right? And ensuring that we're creating this very dynamic thought process around looking at the business from the lens that it needs to be looked at.
Okay, now you've been doing this for the last several years at Oracle, but before that, you came from a data center world where you were designing, right, for Equinix.
Right. Equinix. So
Equinix.
I was what I worked on there was they hired me to kind of look at a lot of analytics and create a kind of an analytics suite around how our customers were using the data centers. And what I ended up working on is working on some capacity planning around what that fill rate, that growth of our data center are experiencing. Things like design densities would take into effect because as you all probably know, over the years, the racks that are being deployed into these data centers became denser and denser.
That's right.
And unfortunately, what happens in the data center world is that those investments tend to be much longer term in relation to the tech refresh cycle that hardware ends up going through. So, as a manufacturer, we try to release a new version of our hardware every year and a half. That like year and a half to 2 year cycle. Well, every hardware manufacturer is probably doing the same thing. But the life of that equipment, whether you use things like depreciation schedules, it's about 4 to 5 years, and you might be able to use it a little bit longer than that. But a data center is designed and invested for 15 to 20 years. So all of a sudden you have, a data center standard that is to a different, let's just say, density standard than what is happening from a lifecycle management within these data centers. Right. So a customer would deploy, and they would be in that data center for multiple years, and within that deployment lifecycle, there would be multiple tech refreshes. That's what happened.
So inside the rack, there's for those who don't know, the IT capacity is increasing in like speed, storage, and whatnot within the IT. But the facility itself, that is the data center facility, power and cooling, were designed for that longer term phase. So they actually are challenged to now keep up with the requirements of those racks for the more power and cooling as a facility. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they're a data center, my job at that point was to understand how the customers were using their data center deployments and try to understand what are their fill rates, what are their true densities, not necessarily just what they were requiring from contractual agreements. And we were able to kind of create an analytics suite to allow us to, even do things like utility strategies, right? I mean, how big of a utility contract we should be procuring, what's the ramp schedule of that utility, and working with utility providers on that capacity planning, because all of that goes upstream to various distribution points, and utilities being one of the main distribution point that starts, is a starting point, and then downstream it goes into the data center and down to the customer rack. So that supply chain has to be factored in if you really want to do appropriate planning, but also consider things like efficiency and sustainability.
Yes. And there's a shift to have like a data center at the edge now.
Right.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I'm actually fascinated by this because, edge, what we would call, is not a new term, right? Initially it started with content distribution networks, right? CDNs, with the Akamais and the Limelights of the world. And how it was defined at that point were caching solutions, right? So making sure that objects that didn't really refresh quite a bit, like images or even do software downloads, right, are cached at closer to the customer. Now, what's fascinating is that with IoT, and initially, several years ago, someone asked me what I thought about IoT, and I said, I don't really understand what IoT is, and it's just Internet of Things, right? I mean, that's what it stands for. Now I'm understanding more and more as we're going, okay, it's about using technology to transform, maybe very mature businesses. Like if you think about IoT and the concept of automotive, right? Self-driving vehicles. The amount of data that you have to collect in order to continue, evolving self-driving vehicles, or at least the software that is actually doing that.
That's right. Like dynamically monitoring all kinds of sensors and signals.
Right. So edge becomes now more of a compute platform, right? In the sense that you have to be closer to the vehicles that are driving this. You have to have the latency in order to make sure that the sensors that are collecting all of this data is being transmitted in a timely fashion. And then the edge is actually doing a lot of the computing and responding to that, right? So, if you imagine, and I don't, know in depth of self-driving cars and how many sensors that they would be required to have.
They're now about 150 to 200 sensors per car.
Right.
Yes.
And think about it probably has to collect that information on a second or microsecond perspective. Now, not all of that is obviously transmitted in time. But, what's going to be interesting is that maybe the car ends up becoming, an edge.
Yes.
Right, where it's collecting that information. A lot of that software is stored in the car itself. And then on a interval basis, it transmits to wherever it needs to transmit to on the edge. Yes. So for me, an edge becomes more of a actual deployment of compute and storage capabilities closer to wherever the product is using it.
Okay.
So I think that what we're going to start seeing, and these are, of course, my opinions, is that cloud generally started as a scale game, right? In the sense that, the bigger the deployment was, the better the economics of that deployment is, right? From a cost per unit perspective.
Right, okay.
However, if you think about it, is that now it's going to be distributed, right? The distributed compute concept within what cloud brought initially is going to be now geographical distribution. I think that's going to be the interesting part, in the sense that how are companies going to contend, whether it's just going to be a select few very large corporations that have the capital purchase capabilities to do this, or there are going to be smaller companies that are a little more agile about reducing the footprint that is required to go into these markets. That's the fascinating part. And
then with 5G, that's even more capacity for these transaction streaming. So more usage. So there's more demand for data center at the edge. So it's like a mobile data center.
Right. But I mean, if you think about it from a data center's perspective, there was a trend of building bigger and larger data centers to support, these massive cloud deployments. And so I think that, the industry is going to have to take a step back and say, well, do I have the product portfolio of data center assets to contend with different use of data center? Like you have to start thinking about why are these data centers being used? How are they being used in order to come up with a portfolio of real estate assets?
Right. Serving different needs,
Right.
different use cases. Right. Okay, fascinating. So what's exciting ahead for you?
You know, I get to look at the world from a interesting perspective in the sense from a scale, right? In the sense that Oracle has this massive global operation, and I'm fortunate enough to kind of work within that system to kind of analyze what's going on in the world. And I'm a personally fascinated by economic trends and geopolitics. And,
yes.
Even though
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me more about it.
Right. And it's funny because I started my career as an engineer, and I think the natural curiosity that I had about why we were doing something enabled me to kind of ask the right questions to start kind of developing my career in the path that I wanted. And I didn't purposely actually develop it that way. It naturally occurred, and with some luck as well. What's exciting to me is that when I see what's going on in the world from the constant shift in trends, whether it's the geopolitical trends or economic trends, I find, having to look at that and find solutions to support those trends really fascinating, right? I mean, you have to be very, very creative and agile in the way you're thinking about the problem. As working at Oracle, we deal with data and not to mention very important data, right? Databases generally are hosting critical data and infrastructure. It's the core infrastructure for some of the applications. And as we're pivoting to the cloud, we have to think about how are we deploying our product and how our customers are using our products. So to me, that's very fascinating in a sense that we're now having to be, working with our customers very closely around the solution instead of, having the customer really drive the solution on their end.
Okay. Wonderful. That's been really interesting conversation. I appreciate you coming in, sharing with me, sharing with the audience. Any last thoughts you want to talk about as far as the trends on the market or even career advice to those?
Career advice. I speak at our college higher orientation, as well as we, Oracle Foundation built a school recently on campus, and it's a charter school. And I have been speaking there, and a lot of people ask me about my career and kind of how I got to where I was, or where I am. And I said, well, obviously I can't speak for everyone's career path, but what I did fairly well is one, ask a lot of questions, but second of all, tie previous experiences that might not be directly related to anything that I was doing, but had kind of a foundation of why I think the way I think. And I end up connecting dots backwards to to kind of define the way I think about the problem. And, I generally, when I speak about these types of things, I start with this one story that I said that my first commercial negotiation that I've ever done came at when I was a Pizza Hut delivery driver. And it was a canceled order. And I said, look, we were just backed up, so the pizza is it's still hot, and I'll give it to you for 50% off. It was a $19.99 pizza, and I gave it for $10. And in return, they gave me a $10 tip. And what I learned from that experience was that in any negotiation, I think that when it's good for both parties, that's a winning outcome. And I just always kind of encourage people to kind of think about their partners, whether it's their internal or external partners, in the same manner. Right.
Think of a win-win strategy.
Right.
To benefit both.
Right.
Great idea. So then you get an with cultural clashes sometimes internally, right? People who are used to this one culture or way of doing business, and you're asking them to do a different type of business.
You're asking them to look at, it's almost like a self-reflection on what they do, right? But I'm a person that I enjoy the constant learning and evolution that I have gone through as a person, and I can't necessarily expect that from everyone, but I think it's a good start in a sense that recently I read this book. It's a fascinating book called The 100-Year Life, and the book starts with I was born in 1976, and at that point the average age in the United States was 75 years old. Since then, the statistics shows that for every decade, the average age has gone up by 3 years. Now, recently there was a report saying that it kind of capped off and it might actually reduce. But at that point, which means that I'm, in my life, the people who are born in my year will have an average life expectancy of 87 years old. So significantly different than the old way of doing things where you retired at 65.
Yes, we have to work longer.
Right, and you only had 10 years to live from there. It's not just working longer, but it's about defining what you do afterwards, right? So before you would retire, let's say in the book talks about the 3 stages of life, right? The birth to, let's say, graduating from college. From there, it's your career, and that's a very large percentage of your existence. And then from there, if you take the 65-year average, retirement, age to your average age of 75, you only have 10 years to plan for, and whether that's the retirement savings or what you want to do afterwards. And all of a sudden, if you take the 65-year retirement age as is, now you have 22 years to kind of figure it out. And 22 years is a very long time.
It's a long time.
Right. So, it talks about kind of creating that more portfolio-like lifestyle in the sense that you have to essentially continuously evolve yourself.
Yes, yes.
And I think that, as a very large organization that is going through its own evolution, that evolution has to be also both tops down and bottoms up. And I think that would be the advice to anyone, and not necessarily within my organization, but any organization or any employee who is going through that career, path.
Right. Thank you so much, Troy, for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us on the whole industry transformation and this global view that you have. It's wonderful to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to those who are watching. Take it up with Jessica Lee, Troy Tazbaz, VP of Corporate Operations from Oracle.
Thank you.